When I was young, I'd listen to the radio, waiting for my favorite
Welcome to the
song.
internationally famous Radio Theatre.
When they played, I'd sing along. It made me smile. Those old melodies still sound so good to me as they melt the years away.
Here they come. Adrian Elsey.
When a girl marries.
Lux Radio Theatre.
Good morning, boys.
Hello, world.
Howdy, everybody.
Van Doogly.
Yibbity, folks.
Good morning, Sammy Sparrow.
What do you say, guys?
It's huge. It is.
The cream of Australian radio talent.
All my best memories come back clearly to me. Some can even make me cry, just like before. It's yesterday once more.
Mr. Jack Davis saying good night and thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Mike Hammond. By the end of the 1960s, the baby boomers were growing up, getting married and having kids, and not necessarily in that order. The Beatles were splitting up, and apart from nearly everyone having long hair and sideburns, the years of rebellion and protest hadn't really changed the world. The Vietnam War still raged, and political conservatives ruled in Canberra and Washington. Radio stations that had made their fortunes partying with the rock and roll generation through their heady, carefree teenage years suddenly woke up with a hangover. It was time for radio to change again. Here to look at radio's second music revolution is the great breakfast broadcaster, Gary O'Callaghan.
At most radio stations until the 1960s, choosing which music was played was a fairly informal process. Sometimes the playlist was decided by knowledgeable record librarians, sometimes on the whim of a program manager, and sometimes the disc jockeys themselves. But by the end of the 1960s, they began to think much more carefully about everything they put to air. Not just the music, but the overall sound of the station itself.
As the 1960s came to a close, there emerged from the ranks of Australia's disc jockeys a man who had set many of the major trends in radio in the coming decades. His name? Rod Muir.
He was the formatics man of more music. He pulled together these marvellous ideas of promotions, programming.
Short playlist, 30 or 40 records. The guys didn't say too much, but gee, it just flew along.
1420 3XY. It's 8:30 right now with Lee Simon. Maybe you're
It
out,
wasn't long before Muir was taking his new format around the country.
Watch out for the sharks.
And this is how tight you had to be. I left a little gap, like a nanosecond, in between the ads and when the records start. And we had a hotline, little red phone that used to ring. We'd go, oh, right, because we knew it was Muir. So I picked it up and went, yeah. He said, if you'll pardon the language, he said, if you're going to leave gaps that effing big, I can sell them, and slam the phone down.
And we would have an American weekend, so that every third record would be an American record, or a black and gold weekend, black artist gold records, etc. And not only that, but he incorporated the double plays, the treble plays, and we had echo.
Good morning.
This is 3XY. Good morning.
And it was all of this was Rod Muir. More music.
Caller.
Oh, was I the 14th caller?
You've won yourself a dishwasher, which I guess you'll be pretty happy with.
Oh, Joe, I would have thought I would have won the panel van.
Oh, really? Well, listen, what we can do about that, I can give you a sticker if you've got a place to put it.
The formats would work in every market with slight modifications. You know, the basic premise was Coca-Cola. Drink ice-cold Coca-Cola because it tastes best when it's ice-cold. You know, and people in Perth like Coca-Cola, people in Melbourne like Coca-Cola.
So they said to me, why don't you come on in, have a crack at this, we'll play music, but you can do a talk music show with George Moore, who was a wonderful music presenter. And maybe we can give this audience of ours, who are now in their 20s, and maybe early 30s, some reason to stick with us.
Denise Beaumont said she'll be down at 10.
John Brennan was the producer, without any doubt the most talented man in radio. He could go with trends. He had an amazing ability to read what the public were wanting, what they were thinking, but even more, he had this extraordinary ability to pick talent.
And then we'll go into a request, okay?
To market the new sound, Muir and his team came up with one of the most famous brand logos of the era.
It was a round piece of denim, and then with a zipper that was half undone, which for those days was very provocative.
We have a remarkable radio station.
And then the logo inscribed inside under the zipper. And it actually came out of a station in Brisbane.
And they had the best staff. You'd just walk in and there'd be stars everywhere.
Hi, Peter. Where are you calling from?
You jump in the lift. And I looked up one morning and there's Gough Whitlam. Or another morning I looked down and there was Graham Kennedy. You know, and they used to have people like David Frost, who was doing the mornings as guest. I mean, you don't get any bigger and better than that.
Let me do the news. I've always wanted to do the news.
Okay, in just a moment.
Making it. I want to read it.
We'll have the news.
But Muir said, right, doing that. You're playing 45 songs, hit radio. Rated its proverbials off. And then the dear lovely Catholic Church said, I think we can move premises. So we moved over to Lavender Bay, just round from Luna Park. The best view in the world. Best view in the world. And we were gods. We were gods, 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 gods.
Well, once again, October rolls around and here we are.
But not every music station followed the trend. In Adelaide, Paul Thompson, the new young manager of station 5KA, had a feeling that the times were changing. Just like the early top 40 radio programmers, he decided to go out into the marketplace.
They would let me stand in the record shop next to the cash register and note who was coming in, what they were buying, and what their details were, their gender and age and so on. And it was the primitive beginnings of radio research, or music research, really. And it was primitive, but it was, it revealed that that people were buying albums; they weren't buying singles. And I thought, together with a young guy who I had brought in from Tasmania to be with me as music director initially, called Barry Bissell, and we put in albums. It was the first album rock station in Australia, and the first by a long way, actually, by very many years.
Barry Bissell was at 70X. Gordon O'Byrne, who's in Perth, he went through 70X. Rod Muir was in Hobart. John Burnley, a lot of big names that came to radio later all went through Hobart. Some of them were born in that neck of the woods, but it was a hotbed of talent for sure.
Oh, JJJ.
In the midst of the massive success of more music format radio, and 20 years after commercial radio had first discovered the youth market, the ABC set up a rock music radio station. It started life as 2JJ and became a nursery for a new generation of talented radio performers and a launching pad for many comedians and rock bands.
And it's humbling to know that my art has touched so many people. And can I just say to those critics who said I couldn't write my own material?
Good morning. After 14 years on air in Sydney, this loud and rebellious radio teenager went national under the call sign Triple J. And its former stars who had moved on to richer pastures still hold some affection for their radio alma mater.
Keep going till you get to the bridge. Veer right again at the T section there, you know, and just go past that.
It has a loyalty, it has a heart, it does good things, and it's great for breaking Australian music, and it's also great for giving idiots like us a go. I mean, we would have probably lasted about 3 weeks in commercial radio. If we'd started, but you know, it gave us a chance for 2 years, because it was very slow started stuff, to get 2 years of getting stuff sort of half right.
The late 1970s also saw the growth of new commercial radio licences on the rapidly growing outer fringes of the metropolitan cities, including 3MP in Victoria and 2GO and 2WS in New South Wales. 2GO was managed by a dynamic radio programmer, Keith Graham. With him at the time was another man who would stamp an indelible mark on Australian radio history, Bob Scott.
He taught me everything I know about radio, and he was just a super guy. And you know, he went on after he left 2GO to Sydney, where he started 2WS.
2WS was the first new commercial station in the very cosy Sydney radio market in more than 40 years, and got a very rough welcome to the big time.
They didn't like us, and in fact they did everything they could to stop us going to air. It was actually a war, and we had a very, very tough time fighting to get a lot of the things that we'd like, and that included being included in the Sydney survey.
Classic Hits 2WS is a remarkable radio station.
WS hit #1 in 1984, then merged with 2GO to form Wesco Radio, which went on to become, at that time, Australia's largest radio network under the driving leadership of Keith Graham.
As he said, I want to own a radio station everywhere you can sail a boat into. And pretty well up the East Coast, that's what we did, because we went on from 2GO and 2WS to end up buying 18 radio stations.
Sadly, at the height of his success, Keith Graham was killed in a car accident. Just when radio had again shown its power to excite and lead the younger generation, a new and rebellious baby forced its way onto the stage.
420209 is the only number to ring in 3AKs.
Australian commercial radio had always transmitted in what's called amplitude modulation, or AM. The clearer, stereo, frequency modulation, or FM, was reserved for the ABC, some emergency services, TV, and a few non-profit community radio stations. The ABC had simultaneously transmitted some programs in FM as early as 1948, but listeners had no reason or inclination to buy special FM receivers. In the late 1970s, the energetic Rod Muir mounted a concerted campaign for commercial FM broadcasting. Finally, in 1980, a limited number of FM licences in each capital city were offered to new operators.
That caused a bit of a split within the ranks of commercial radio, because the AMers felt that they had, I suppose, their birthright to convert to FM. But FM radio was given to new players. And in those days, there was only 7 commercial licences granted in capital cities around Australia.
Eon Studio, Rock Force 1's making approach to the city. Helipad drop-off, Lee sign.
First on the air was Eon FM, broadcasting from South Melbourne.
And people like John Laws and Mike Willesee and Graham Kennedy got together, and there were a lot of applicants for these licences.
Rod Muir's own consortium won the licence for 2MMM, and his promise was to triple your music. The other FM stations were Fox FM in Melbourne, Perth's 96 FM, Today FM in Sydney, and Brisbane's 4MMM. The first FM station in the Adelaide area was SAFM, which commenced transmission in late 1980.
Another 20 minutes of non-stop stereo with...
And those early days were great because we were building a radio station, almost knocking on doors, asking people would they listen. And people would sometimes ring us and think that we were a shop that repaired radios.
As FM has a real advantage when it transmits music, the new stations naturally took the pop music route. Some chose to feature smooth adult sounds, while others went for hard rock.
So you had Rod Muir in Sydney and Cherie Romero and people like that in Today, and Gary Roberts in the West, and me in Adelaide. All programmers, and not as good at sales as we probably should have been. So it was a perilous time, that early time, and a lot of the companies only just survived. I don't think it's generally known how close almost all of them were to falling over.
But the new players held their faith, did some market research on their listeners, and made some adjustments to their sound. gradually, as they found their niche and the right sound, the audiences began to move over. Melbourne's Fox FM was one that found success only after drastic changes to its initial format.
It was fantastic because it was basically like a relaunch of a radio station 12 months after it had started and failed, so it was very exciting. We, did start from nothing, virtually, and create a very successful radio station.
It actually said that AW hadn't lost its soul, that we just lost its up.
As the new kids on the block began to outrate the old AM stations, there followed what some called the radio wars. The old stations tried to hit back by developing their own stereo transmission called Stereo AM.
AM tried to do AM stereo, which was a ridiculous thing because nobody had an AM stereo receiver, and people were getting AM and FM receivers.
We went into 2SM just for the launch of the incredibly popular AM stereo.
Yeah.
Everyone's going, what? AM stereo.
But AM stereo was not as clear as FM and failed to revive the old AM music stations.
Reminds me of the story of the contortionist who died in his own arms. Tragedy.
And then Triple M went #1 for the first time.
Yeah, and we were there with all that Rod Muir, crazy Doug Mulray, Cranny. It was a fantastic time, 1984, 85.
It was the time of long lunches.
FM radio.
And suddenly, for the big ratings party, you'd be walking out the door with bottles of Crew going to you.
It was actually Dom Perignon.
Dom Perignon under your arms.
I've never seen so many opened, half-empty bottles of Dom Perignon. In 1984, that was, and that says a lot about the 80s.
It was enormous fun.
It was pink Dom Perignon.
Yeah.
Rosé
ridiculous.
Dom Perignon.
Soon afterwards, the crazy 80s business party came to an end. And in the crash that followed, Australia's oldest and most successful radio network went under the hammer.
When young Warwick came along and Fairfax went broke, they sold everything, including the Macquarie network, and it went to some person in Queensland, Cassidy. And I remember Cassidy rang me and said, look, you missed out on the main game. I've got it. But how would you like to buy 5DN? And I said, well, yes.
Eventually, with many AM stations facing ruin, the government relented and permitted some of them a belated place on the FM band. It was a brutal reinvention costing millions of dollars in licence fees. Those who moved to the FM band included 5KA and 5DN in Adelaide, Perth's 6PM, Melbourne's 3KZ and 3DB, then known as 3TT, Brisbane's 4BK, and Sydney's 2UW and 2WS.
By the end of the 80s, FM stations had captured the big spending youth market, so prized by advertisers, and profits were soaring. Coming up next, how the big entertainment corporations laid out millions of dollars to build the FM networks that we know today. Owning a radio broadcasting licence was always seen as the first step to a good way to make money. But few predicted the size of the fortunes that were to be made from FM radio. Here to tell that story is someone who knows their way around an FM radio studio, Gavin Wood.
From its very beginnings, radio had attracted the interest of the existing media moguls of the day. Many of the first radio broadcasting licences were taken out or quickly bought up by newspaper groups, theatre owners and music publishers. It seemed natural that the businessmen with experience in entertainment and advertising would be the best people to make the success of the new radio medium. And so it was when FM was licensed in 1980. Many of the new FM operators, like Rod Muir, had already enjoyed extensive experience in AM radio.
Beach baby,
That experience, adjustments and changes to format, and some clever promotions meant those who persisted in the hard early years were rewarded.
Personally, I was very angry with the Catholic Church and the 2SM people. I thought they'd done the wrong thing by me, and I was out to get them. And I took great pleasure in doing that.
By the mid-1980s, FM had become the dominant force in music broadcasting and the owner of the youth market. Massive offers began to be made to acquire these jewels in radio's crown.
Eon FM.
Soon after Eon top-rated for the first time in Melbourne, it was sold to Rod Muir's Triple M Group for the record price of $37.5 million. The largest network of all is Austereo, and it began its rise from Adelaide in 1986. Starting with SAFM, it acquired Fox FM in Melbourne, followed by Sydney's Today FM and 4BK Brisbane, which it converted to FM in 1990.
Can you handle that one, Bear?
Keep on rocking, Ray. There's some very talented people in the Austereo organisation, people like Greg Smith and Paul Thompson, etc., who brought their philosophies to the station, and we hired Wendy Harmer and Jamie Dunn Agro, and we took on Triple M.
But now they've got their own balls!
Brought in a great programmer called Brad March, who'd been with Austereo for quite a while. Keith Williams we brought up from Triple M in Melbourne, and Paul Holmes, who'd been working up on the Gold Coast, we brought him down.
1996 saw a complicated arrangement in which Austereo purchased the Hoyts-owned Triple M network, and they all came into the Village Roadshow entertainment conglomerate. Australian cities still only had a handful of commercial FM stations, compared with the United States with 4 or 5 times as many. So more FM licences were approved and put to auction. DMG Radio Australia, a subsidiary of Britain's Daily Mail General Trust, laid down hundreds of millions of dollars.
And many different people bidding. And in that incredibly and competitive, difficult environment, sweat-filled environment, I might say, I've never lost so much weight in a single session in my life, we got the licence for $155 million.
They quickly established the Nova network, which brought wider competition.
I don't think we would have gone from Triple J to an incumbent station. We worked at Nova. We came to work here because it was new and it was exciting, and we knew that we were the first people to be on air and to be on the spearhead of a station, and then to be spearhead of a network, and that appealed enormously to my ego. Is this breakfast or is this lunch?
I think it's a bit of a crossover.
Is it? It's brunch. That's what they call it.
Yeah, veggie on toast.
Yeah, you could have just had that at home, really.
And you know what happened? I said, welcome to Nova. Oh, geez, let's hope we don't bugger this shit up or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I swore I just said shit. And then when it was the Nova Networks owned by DMG, an international company, when they cut that up to play to the bosses, they cut my bit swearing out. So I said, welcome to Nova.
They've been cutting all that stuff out
for years.
Ever since.
It is 8:59. See you later.
See you tomorrow.
Commercial radio in Australia was always a business, but in most cases, it was a small business. Today, the corporation accountants have taken control. But so long as talent attracts listeners, and there are some programmers who can recognise talent and take a gamble on it, then FM radio will remain a source of the latest music. The internet has to be watched and read. iPods have to be reloaded and loaded. But radio still comes to you whenever you want, wherever you are, and can be enjoyed whatever you're doing. It's certain FM radio will continue to delight and surprise you, and most important of all, to entertain you. Coming up next, revolution or evolution? The radio listeners get their revenge with Talkback Radio. Australians have never been very good at sitting still and being lectured. We like to respond and let the speaker know what we think. Some even say we are the world's champion hecklers, ready to prick the ego balloon of the pompous and question authority everywhere. Perhaps that's why everyone was so excited, but also so wary, when the authorities in 1967 finally agreed to allow us to talk back to radio personalities. Now here's one of our most respected broadcasters who made his name in talk radio, Steve Liebman.
Thanks, Gavin. We Aussies certainly do love our talkback radio. In fact, ever since Ormsby Wilkins put the first phone call on air legally in August 1967, Australians in their millions have made radio talkback shows their favourite on-air format. Today, talkback is a key part of the top-rating breakfast and morning shows in most capital cities. And of course, this unpredictable and rebellious form of entertainment got off to a somewhat rocky start. Not all the great stars of radio who'd spent years talking to their audience were able to adapt and enjoy talking with their listeners.
Time now to meet Andrea.
Yes, have a gander at me, for the love of Mike. Where have I got myself to?
Are you ready to talk to the first person, madam?
I'm quite ready. I don't know what the heck I'm going to say.
The earliest form of audience involvement was the listener letter. From children's shows to home hints for housewives, listeners were always encouraged to get involved. However, the strict and seemingly inviolable federal communications laws stated that telephone conversations must always remain private. Once again, it was American radio that showed the way. One night in 1945, an announcer named Barry Gray on station WMCA New York telephoned band leader Woody Herman and then held the phone earpiece up against the studio microphone. About the same time in Australia, one announcer found an imaginative way around the ban on putting phone calls to air. In Sydney in the late 1940s, a former Perth broadcaster, Eric Parent, would conduct clever one-sided telephone conversations with his listeners.
He would find out and say, well now, before I get around to finding out whether you know the bigger, Mary, what about your family? How many you got in it? He would talk about the family, ask them beautiful social questions, etc. Inquire about this.
In the 1960s, Sydney broadcaster John Thompson and his sidekick Buzz Kennedy would illegally tape record phone calls from listeners and replay the edited comments on air. Barry Jones on 3DB found another way to broadcast his listeners' comments.
So I'd deliver my spiel, we'd put on a record, we'd run like mad for the telephones at the other end, and then Peter Surrey and I, and there was a secretary as well, the three of us would take down the gist of what was being said, and then we'd run back like fury to the other end, and then we'd go back to the microphone.
Finally, in 1967, strict regulations were introduced designed to control any bad language and prevent any slander and libel. Stations were required to record the phone conversations and pass them through a 7-second tape loop to allow announcers to circumvent any breaches of the broadcasting code.
And everybody's saying, you know, what's going to happen, of course. The switchboard lit up immediately.
Now, sir, what's on your mind?
One of the first on the air on day one was veteran journalist and commentator Ormsby Wilkins on Sydney's 2UE.
You want to talk to me privately, all right? I'll make a suggestion to you.
Yes, Orm.
When I come off the air, you call me on 920444.
920444.
You've got it.
Righto, Aubrey.
Righto. Aubrey. Now, well, that's as good a name as any, I guess.
Another who started on the first day of Talkback was a man who came not from journalism, but from a disc jockey background, Mike Walsh.
Mike had the ability to be able to link with the listener or the question of the person who was ringing, and he had an answer either to them or for them, so that they would go away feeling as though, well, I've achieved something today, I've spoken to him and I've learned something on possibly what my problems are and what the solution could be. He was very good.
Some stations moved to 24-hour-a-day solid talkback, and a few of them even managed to top the ratings. Talkback seemed to require some level of education or life experience that enabled personalities to speak with authority on any subject their listeners were inclined to raise. Veteran announcer Norman Banks proved to be a natural, especially when he teamed with Ormsby Wilkins. One man in particular was able to blend a perfectly pitched voice with a fast mind and was at once at ease with it all.
Hello world, this is John Law.
John Laws had learned in his disc jockey days how to project his personality.
Good morning and welcome. We're here until 12. First one.
And they liked that. They liked hearing about what you were doing. And then you got written up in magazines and things and got publicity at a personal level rather than the radio station just getting the publicity. So it wasn't difficult to become a personality. It was fashionable at the time.
It's a bit like why Frank Sinatra was still, to me, the greatest singer in the world was that he didn't just come out of the speakers. He stepped out of the speakers into the room. And great broadcasters have that effect on me. Laws is always standing next to you. He's not in the radio, he's out in the room.
This is Long John's Party Line, 9297044.
Laws made his talkback debut on an evening wisecracking show called Party Line.
The boss has given up cigarettes. I offered him one today. I gave him up for 25 minutes, I think, the other day. That takes willpower, doesn't it?
Suburban conversations took over the mornings, with announcers spinning a potent blend of commentary and talkback.
And again, I was lucky to be in the right place in the right time, and I was the first person to do talkback in South Australia.
Talkback also began to fill the counselling role that radio had played since early days, when announcers answered listeners' problems by letter.
So it's not difficult to relate to people, not being able to pay the phone bill. I've certainly been there, or the electricity bill, or being evicted, or being thrown out in the middle of the night for being too rowdy or drunk or whatever. It happens no matter what the socio-economic level. So if you are prepared to realise that you're no different to anybody else, it's not hard.
The talkback counselling took a dramatic turn the day a listener rang John Laws and said he was about to kill himself. Many listeners stopped what they were doing as the drama unfolded on their radio.
What have you done?
I've cut my wrist.
Oh, God. Well, you better do something about that before we do anything else, hadn't you?
I don't know if it's worth it.
Well, of course it's worth it.
Laws also built a considerable rapport with working men and especially long-distance truck drivers. When the truckies staged a protest for better conditions and blocked the Hume Highway, it was Laws they called to help with negotiations.
Well, John, we're at the end of our tether. We can't move. We can't afford to move.
Yeah, all right, Ted. Well, I'm sorry for you, and you know that I'm sympathetic towards you.
As his audience grew, Laws was able to move stations and take an entire audience with him. He had honed his skills as a radio salesman years before, and advertisers now bid richly for him to sell their products. John Laws became embroiled in controversy when he was accused of styling his editorial comments to favour his sponsors.
People get me to do commercials because I have success with them. And that's what you've got to do. It's commercial radio. That's why I never quite understood the Broadcasting Control Board or whatever it was. I mean, commercial radio, what did they expect to hear on it, if not commercials?
I mean, you know, people like me, I'm a commercial animal. You know, and that's what I do, for God's sake. You know, to try and restrict me and other people from earning a quid, you know, it's un-Australian.
Hello world, this is John Laws.
Laws was the first radio star in 30 years to successfully network his program around Australia, and his earnings put him amongst the highest paid radio personalities in the world. He is unquestionably the foremost radio personality of his time, and the man who defined commercial radio in Australia for an entire generation.
Laws was unbelievable, wasn't he? I used to stand and watch him work. Now, this is 1970s. And I used to stand and watch him work. And you only had to watch the man for 10 minutes and you learned so much.
He's been the benchmark for so many. I always remember people going crook about the money that Laws he earned. And I said, don't be shirty on Jack for earning all that dough, because he may earn that much, but because he earns that much, you earn that much. Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
People need stars. They want entertainment. They want a bit of colour. You know, I think I used to call it a bucket of rhinestones. And there was a sense of entertainment and showbiz about Laws, which I don't think any other presenter really quite captured in the same way.
The early experiments with Talkback proved that listeners liked hearing what their fellow Australians had to say. But it soon became obvious that in the right hands, Talkback could provide more than just passing entertainment. Sometimes it could even start a riot or save a life. Next, the stars who made the open line their own and the more memorable moments of Talkback radio.
The power of Talkback radio wasn't immediately apparent when those first tentative callers came on the air to talk back in 1967. Allowing anyone to ring in and say anything that was on their mind might have been entertaining dial-in democracy, but stations soon found the quality could be quite erratic. Here to introduce our look at some of the more memorable moments in Talkback is Nolene Brown.
Thank you, Steve. Part of the fun and entertainment of Talkback is its unpredictability. And somehow the old rules of radio broadcasting behaviour just didn't apply with the birth of this raucous new baby. It soon became apparent that the polite telephone etiquette that Australians had been taught for generations simply could not apply to radio's new open line.
Boy, when I scream, and you're going to hear it down the end of the street. Have you talked to other people?
It became clear that confrontation boosted Talkback's popularity, and controversy was never far away. Bob Muir on 6IX graduated from sporting commentator to Talkback guru and made his name the day he hung up on the state premier, Sir Charles Court.
I said to Sir Charles, don't hang your cheap political labels on me, get off, and I cut him off. And of course, after that, the newspapers picked up on it. I was suddenly controversial, and that made people tune in to see this animal, this new Talkback animal, Muir.
There is a law for the rich and a law for the poor. And
Another who came to rule the Talkback airwaves in Perth was journalist Howard Sattler, one of the first to carry the new American tag of shock jock.
Well, the commentators are normally perceived to be right-wing in their views. That's probably why they're commentators. We're not sort of powder puff type people, not do-gooders, definitely the do-gooder element. So, and I think most of your audience is going to agree with you. There's no question about that. I like more to disagree. The internet has changed things a bit because those who disagree don't really want to take you on as much as they used to. They'd rather send you a vitriolic message.
Veteran talk radio host John Pearce discovered the value of confrontation when he lost his temper with a caller.
And by the time he got to me, he was almost inclined to apologise. But by then I'd been getting the switchboard reports, and we'd never had a reaction like that. And it wasn't all bad either.
Consider yourself having done it. Please go home. You're making the joint look untidy.
God, you're terrible.
I know, but I'm having it attended to. Thank God nobody would ever take you seriously on this or any other matter. Go on.
So strong opinions, dynamite. John Pearce was probably one of the best talkback hosts I think we've ever had.
Music radio provided many other personalities who made the successful transition to talk. In Adelaide, stars like Jeremy Cordeaux, Bob Francis and Leon Biner were among the talk radio kings who'd first learned the art of projecting their personality while spinning records.
Leon wanted to get away, I think, from being a music personality to being a talk personality, because he was developing interview relationships with Hollywood movie stars and people like that. So he would go to the States and record a lot of interviews for radio and television and come back with them. And now he's quite a force in Adelaide radio as a talk presenter. Politicians and people are very much aware of him. Yeah.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the program.
Bob Francis developed a strong, opinionated stance that made his talkback show an instant success. There have been many theories as to why listeners have found rudeness and aggression entertaining rather than off-putting. One is known as the Matador syndrome.
And that's where the caller is bloody boring, and the personality knows it is, and the audience knows it is, and the audience is secretly or silently saying, kill him, kill him.
What you've got to remember with talkback radio is that being right is part of the fun, but the real fun is to be entertaining. And if you keep a person on air just because you haven't got another call to go to, and that person is as dull as ditchwater, you're not doing yourself any favours.
And I suppose it was closer to what the Americans do now. It'd take a long time to set the program up, relatively speaking, because I wouldn't take the first call until it was the one I wanted. And by that, they had to be at least coherent. And I used to specialise in human interest stories, so I'd wait for something that I thought I could do something with. Then after that, I'd take anything that came along.
It was on the night of his last appearance on radio.
Politicians began using Talkback to reach out to the voters.
Yes, I find of all the media, radio is the one that I feel most at ease with, because you actually have a conversation with people on radio. You have a conversation with the interviewer, and through that with the public, and you get a far greater idea of what people are thinking on radio than you do in a news conference or a television interview.
7 people have died in South Africa since a nationwide state of emergency.
Melbourne's most controversial and longest surviving Talkback star has been the man they call the human headline, Darren Hinch.
And if you going after other people, then you've got to be fairly honest about your own life. And if, I always say, if somebody, in times people said, oh, how dare you say that about the dead? And I've always argued that all history owes the dead the truth. I said, if you find out something terrible about me and you've been banned from printing it because of our stupid defamation laws, go for it.
Weekends on radio were a time for more relaxed programs, and a new kind of Talkback style developed, information and lifestyle. Most successful were the morning gardening shows, where new stars like Don Burke emerged.
Easy ways to look after your backyard with... Who would have thought you'd bring gardening? This is where Brennan was brilliant. I mean, bring gardening to the point where it became the second highest rating program on the station. And this bloke's knowledge was amazing. And he did all of this just with the microphone. It's like the show he did on TV.
When I worked in nurseries and I started to talk to people about what we were trained in, gardening, they weren't that interested. They actually didn't have a garden. They had a life that they lived. They had kids and dogs and maybe swimming pools and cats and plants and neighbours.
Don, tell me about the feed and grow mats. You just showed me one. They look fantastic.
Yeah, they sort of look like my wife's pancakes a bit. What do you reckon when you look at them? A bit like...
I haven't seen your wife's pancakes. I wouldn't
The
know.
other one I worked out was that the gardeners in the media were telling you how to spend your whole life working harder and harder and harder in the garden, how to prune to perfection and all these technical things. And ordinary people went, what? No, I want to go to the football. I want to go to the beach. I want to play with the kids. I want to do it quickly.
He pioneered a format which provided conspicuous success, and other people have then tried to imitate but haven't done it as well as he has.
Talkback has lasted 40 years, and its newest kings are Neil Mitchell in Melbourne and Ray Hadley in Sydney. Mitchell is an award-winning journalist who came to radio almost by default.
My first kick into radio was, I was editor of the Herald. At the time, Rupert Murdoch bought the paper, and I was having lunch with Darren Hinch. I had actually had Hinch on Hinch had me on his program every day, telling him what was in the paper just after he hit the streets. And we had lunch one day, and it happened to be the day that the sale was confirmed. So the lunch went on, and Hinch at the end of the lunch said, well, I'm going on holidays in a couple of weeks. Do you want to fill in? So I did. Filled in for 2 weeks for Hinch and stayed on then.
Just say a tablet that gets your blood pressure up or down, as the case may be.
Ray Hadley began with calling football and quickly proved to have the personality required to carry mainstream talk shows.
But now Hadley has become an outstanding general broadcaster, and he's got the common touch. You know, he knocks about and gets out with them. Yeah, he's only just beginning, but he's a wonderful, wonderful talent.
The key to a successful Talkback show is the ability to stay on top of events and to be as entertaining as the time and the subject permits. But when the sun goes down and we see what Barry Humphries once described as the flickering blue haze of television descending over Australian suburbs, nighttime radio comes alive and offers a different Talkback experience. Next up, listening into Hearts on the Nightline. Radio has always provided companionship. When radio's prime time at night was overtaken by television, the teenagers filled the gap and disc jockeys kept school students company while they did their homework. But nights came alive for adults again in the early 1970s, when Talkback meant radio could broadcast real conversations and provide real company, when most of television was scripted and rehearsed. Long before reality TV, there was reality radio. To journey with us into the realm of the night owls, here's Ross Higgins.
Some people say that broadcasters work best when they show some empathy for their audience and bring people together. If that's true, then good talkback radio can certainly achieve that goal. Not everyone who lives alone is lonely, but many of those on their own do welcome a bit of companionship from time to time. In today's big cities, where it's possible to live invisibly and go through life without having to talk to anyone very much, radio allows us to eavesdrop legally on real and spontaneous conversations, and sometimes even to join in. Of course, it's good if it's also a bit entertaining as well.
Well, hello. Hello. You dull bludgeon.
As a radio announcer, I always hang my hat on the ability to talk one-on-one to people. A lot of people in radio forget about that. They're just showmen performing on a stage. But I think if you can hook a person in one-on-one, they're driving along, they're talking, you're talking to them and they're listening to you and they're responding, I think that's the secret of radio.
At first, late-night talkback in the late 1960s was much like the new open-line shows being broadcast during the day, announcers taking calls on just about anything that came into the listeners' minds. Then, around 1970, a Sydney clergyman, the Reverend Roger Bush, filled in for John Pearce on 2GB one day and quickly showed he had a true empathy for the callers and a genuine interest in their problems and their opinions. He was soon given his own late-night show and began to set topics and restrict callers to those subjects.
As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly.
And the family at night are generally people that have turned off television or have had a long and hard day, maybe sickness and illness in their lives that they want to talk to us about, and we become an extension to their family. And that's a marvellous thing. That's really, that's getting down through that speaker into their homes and being part of their life.
Bush was followed at 2GB by journalist Ian Parry Oakton, who stayed with the Bush format of one subject for the entire show, allowing callers the time to open up about their real-life experiences.
I wasn't interested in people's opinions. I was interested in using Talkback as group therapy to get everybody to share their experience. We could all learn from each other, but it was also reality. It was much more real than getting opinions. It was actually finding out what it was like to, I don't know, as a guy to come home and find all your possessions on the front doorstep. Those sort of experiences of life that nobody ever talked about.
Hello, Ian.
Hi.
I'm the victim of divorce.
A victim. Parry Oakton's forum topped Sydney nighttime ratings for years, and listeners heard callers telling secrets they had withheld even from their priests.
Usually I find the most common thing is that people aren't together enough to be able to form a relationship in order to communicate.
The late 1970s also saw the rise of Brian Wilshire, a journalist and radio personality who began a late-night talk show that continues to this day. Wilshire's many and varied subjects and expert guests were also mixed with a grab bag of conspiracy theories, which provided endless water cooler talk the next day.
And I was contacted by someone who, let me say, was in a position to know a certain amount of the picture. And we went for a walk around Sydney one day, and so as not to be recorded, because he was taking more risk than I was. And I said, why are they building these computer centres in such a hurry? I can understand they want security, that's understandable. What's the hurry? And his answer was, because they're preparing for war.
Following along the counselling and confessional theme, other priests began taking to the late-night airwaves. Among them, Father Jim McLaren, Father Mick Harfield, and the Reverend Alex Kenworthy.
Well, Jim McLaren was a highly gifted priest. He was a man of for all seasons. He spent 10 years before I asked him to come aboard, assist with the program. He spent 10 years in parishes, and you can't spend 10 years in parishes without finding out where people are at.
But not everyone wanted quiet, empathetic radio. John Pearce was the first to take a stick to the late-night callers, and his sharp wit and no-nonsense style entertained those with a masochistic streak.
Joan, hello.
Hello, Stan.
Goodness gracious, another drunk.
Oh,
And then there was the larger-than-life personality who would eventually become known as the most complained-about man in radio, Stan Zemanek.
I mean, I got hauled over the coals in this place for calling some New Zealander a sheepshagger. Well, I mean, I said it with fun and he had a laugh about it, everybody had a laugh about it. But next thing I know, I'm in the General Manager's office saying, you shouldn't say that about New Zealanders, the sheepshagger. Well, you know, give me a break.
Stan was pure Sydney, brash, loud, argumentative, and above all, entertaining.
I beg your pardon, you called me a dickhead?
Well, you called me an alcoholic.
Well, you are. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. I am a performer, and I've always said I'm there to entertain and inform. And anybody that doesn't entertain won't inform. And Laws is the same. And that's the way that I am. I've always been exactly the same. And yes, I do go over the top. There's no argument about that. But I believe 100% in everything that I say. There's no ifs and buts about that.
Stan Zemanek went on to achieve great success in television for many years, hosting a revival of Beauty and the Beast. But it was on radio that he was a total original, and where he set audience records that may never be broken.
No one in the radio industry has ever been able to be #1 in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney. I had 22% in Brisbane, 22.6% in Sydney and 14% in Melbourne. Now, nobody has ever done that.
But amidst all the talkback, the ABC has found there's a national audience for a solidly entertaining general magazine program. The highest rating of the late shows for many years has been the ABC's Tony Delroy.
And so from very humble beginnings of 2 stations and not a lot of audience, it's now very substantial, 500,000 to 750,000 listeners.
Delroy is a former journalist who learned his trade in radio newsrooms before graduating to the Talkstars chair.
I think one of the most important factors of the show is that I am able to present an international expert to somebody in Darwin, in Rockhampton, in Fitzroy Crossing. And these people in their everyday life would not have a chance to hear this person or seek out their knowledge. They can actually talk to them.
In Melbourne, for many years, nighttime talk radio was the domain of the Reverend Alex Kenworthy, and his successors have been some of radio's most experienced and best-loved announcers.
Well, I think it is chemistry, and I think it's the basis of what comedy and humour is all about. If it was 2 blokes sitting there every night agreeing with each other, it'd probably last a year. But because there's this conflict, whether it's cod or real, there's humour there.
I don't have an act. I don't have a floor show. What you see is what you get. And I think it's probably just a matter of being natural and being accepted. And if you are, well, then you're not trying to impress, so you don't burn yourself out by pretending to be what you're not.
The late night talk format gradually extended overnight, and the pioneers of talk on radio's graveyard shift included Owen Delaney and Keith McGowan.
Owen Delaney made something out of Mid-Dawn, and I reckon that I've taken it to the next step. And for me, the last 17 years of my career have been fantastic. And people overnight, they listen to you. They hear what you say. They're not being distracted by getting the kids off to school or cooking food or phones ringing or you know, they're either listening to you in the dark or maybe they're sitting up or whatever, or maybe making themselves a cup of tea or getting up in the middle of the night for a wee and leaving and turning the radio on for half an hour before they doze off.
Today, even the FM stations have recognised the power of late night talkback, and the Spoon Man runs a national late show on the Triple M network.
Getting stuck into stupidity and hypocrisy and the things that make Australia and I guess the world not as pleasant a place to be as it could. So is there an element of zealot in there, maybe? Yeah, I think maybe. But not a single issue zealot, no.
And young people come to me all the time and say, how do I get started in radio? I say, go and do a course, learn how to project your voice, do some work in community radio, terrific hands-on experience. I said, but when you get behind the microphone, there's one thing you must be an original, be a one-off. Don't imitate Neil Mitchell or Stan Zemanek or John Laws, because there's only one of them, and you have to find your own niche. And maybe along the way I've found myself, and this is who I am, folks, and this is my life.
But I think that the people like Laws and myself, we're a dying breed. And unfortunately, because of the accountants that run radio stations, they're going to bring people who are, I suppose, less abrasive, don't cause as much trouble, are willing to toe the line, so therefore they're not going to be very entertaining. They're just going to be straight up and down. But, you know, what this country needs and what broadcasting needs is colourful characters like myself and Laws.
Talkback not only allowed the listener on air to argue, complain and confess. It also caused a revolution in how news and current affairs could be covered on radio. Instead of having to run around with a tape recorder, stations now had the ability to get their news reporters and indeed anyone in the news to speak directly on air.
In our next episode, we look at how radio does one thing faster and easier than any other medium. Radio gets out and about to tell us what's happening instantly, from the scene of the latest news event, the racetrack or the sporting field. It's an exciting story, so I hope you'll join me. I'm Mike Hammond. Bye for now.